Welcome to this explainer. Today we're unraveling the incredible, honestly almost cinematic true story of a master spy hiding at the absolute highest levels of U.S. intelligence. We're talking about Ana Montes. She literally climbed the ranks to become the Defense Intelligence Agency's top expert on Cuba, all while secretly working for the exact government she was supposed to be analyzing. It's an absolutely fascinating look at deception, psychology, and the hidden vulnerabilities inside our most secure institutions. Let's dive in.
Arrested in the shadows.
Okay, I want you to picture the scene. It's just 10 days after the devastating terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001. The entire U.S. government is on maximum alert. The nation's focus is, understandably, completely locked on the aftermath of those strikes and the imminent response. But behind the scenes, right in the middle of all that chaos, a very quiet, highly classified, and incredibly urgent operation was going down in Washington, D.C. On September 21st, the FBI swoops in and arrests a 44-year-old woman named Ana Montes. Now, to be clear, Montes had absolutely nothing to do with 9/11. But her arrest had to happen at that exact chaotic moment for one absolutely critical reason. You see, the U.S. was actively preparing its classified plans for the invasion of Afghanistan. Montes was a senior analyst at the DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency. Because of her ultra-high clearance level, she was about to be assigned to work on those exact war plans. The FBI and the DIA simply couldn't risk her getting her hands on that intel.
So how did we get here?
Let's look at the perfect recruit. Her journey actually didn't start in the shadows at all. It started right in plain sight. Back in 1984, Montes was working a clerical job over at the Department of Justice, and she was remarkably open about her political beliefs, often speaking out against U.S. policies in Central America. She wasn't hiding her dissent one bit. And you know what? That vocal opposition acted like a giant beacon. It quickly caught the ear of Cuban officials operating in D.C. They arranged a meeting, and well, she agreed to help Cuba. Knowing she needed actual insider access to be useful, she applied to the DIA. So by the time she walked through those doors for her very first day of work in 1985, she was already a fully recruited spy. The really crucial point to understand here is that Cuban intelligence didn't have to coerce her or use blackmail. They just observed her public stances and correctly figured out that she'd be totally sympathetic to their cause. Just through basic observation, they secured a highly motivated spy and dropped her straight inside the Pentagon's key intelligence producer.
Which brings us to her secrets in plain sight.
Montes wasn't just your run-of-the-mill analyst. She was the DIA's absolute top expert on Cuba. She was highly respected all throughout the U.S. intelligence community. And sure, security officials knew about her foreign policy views, but they had literally zero reason to suspect she was sharing secrets. I mean, she even passed government polygraph tests. But behind that flawless public resume, she was actively leaking highly sensitive military info. She even went so far as to deliberately distort the U.S. government's official intelligence views on Cuba. She was completely shaping the narrative from the inside out.
So you're probably wondering, how do you steal secrets for 16 years without getting caught? Well, by never actually stealing a physical secret. Montes never took a single document or electronic file out of that DIA building. Not one. Instead, she used this meticulous, memory-based 5-step system. First, she'd simply memorize the classified details while sitting at her desk. Second, she'd go home and type all those memorized details onto her personal laptop. Third, she transferred that data onto encrypted disks. Fourth, she'd get coded instructions from her Cuban handlers over a shortwave radio. And finally, step 5, she'd do a face-to-face handoff of those encrypted disks. It was entirely self-contained. It left virtually zero physical trail at work. Now, to manage all of this complex, covert communication, she obviously couldn't just rely on her memory for the encryption part. According to the investigation files, she used a specialized cheat sheet. This was a physical tool provided directly by her Cuban handlers that let her encrypt her outgoing intel and decrypt those shortwave radio instructions she was getting. But eventually came the unraveling. Because as careful as she was, no system is totally foolproof. But her detection was an agonizingly slow burn. The very first crack in her armor actually showed up way back in 1996. A really sharp colleague at the DIA just had a gut feeling that Montes might be under the influence of Cuban intelligence, and they reported it. A security official interviewed her, but she denied everything, and the file was basically put away. It sat gathering dust for 4 years. Then, in 2000, that same security officer learned the FBI was actively hunting for an unidentified Cuban mole in Washington. He remembered that 1996 interview, connected the dots, and called the bureau. And that is what directly led to the 2001 surveillance and her ultimate arrest.
Once the FBI officially opened the investigation, they definitely didn't rush it. They painstakingly built this airtight case using intense physical and electronic surveillance plus covert searches of her property. Actually, the FBI was intentionally waiting to arrest her. They really wanted to catch her red-handed in a face-to-face meeting so they could identify her Cuban handler, too. But, as we mentioned at the start of this explainer, the tragedy of 9/11 forced their hand. The immediate threat of her getting access to the Afghanistan war plans meant the FBI had to ditch the trap and take her down right then and there. A price for ideology. Looking at an espionage operation of this massive scale, 16 years of handing over highly classified military intel to a foreign government, you've got to ask yourself, what was the motivation? You naturally assume it involved millions of dollars hidden in offshore accounts, or maybe some terrifying, life-threatening blackmail, right? But shockingly, the answer is zero. Nothing. She accepted exactly $0 as payment for passing along America's secrets. The only money she ever took from her handlers was just minor reimbursements for out-of-pocket expenses to run the espionage itself, like, buying a laptop. She absolutely did not do this to get rich. Looking objectively at the sources and even her own admissions, her motivation was pure ideology. She simply fundamentally disagreed with the foreign policy of the United States regarding Cuba and Central America. She felt the U.S. was treating Cuba unfairly, and she used her incredibly high position of trust to unilaterally level the playing field, exactly as she saw fit. She was driven entirely by her own internal belief system. But acting on that ideology had some truly devastating real-world consequences. The fallout was severe. In 2002, Montes pled guilty and was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. And even more troublingly, she acknowledged revealing the identities of at least 4 American undercover intelligence officers who were actively working in Cuba at the time, putting their lives and their operations in direct, immediate danger. I want to leave you with a provocative thought to wrap up today's explainer. We spend billions of dollars on security clearances, background checks, and incredibly advanced digital firewalls to keep our secrets safe from bribery and extortion. But if the most damaging spies aren't looking for a payday, and they aren't being blackmailed, and instead they're driven entirely by their own internal unseen beliefs, well, how can we ever truly predict who might be operating quietly in the shadows? It's something to think about the next time you hear about a major intelligence breach. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning.